Hey fearsome friends, are you ready to sit back, relax, and listen to some truly terrifying tales? I hope so. Enjoy and keep being creepy. When I was in middle school, I went to a friend's birthday sleepover where we did the typical girl things. Painted nails, gave makeovers, and watched a movie. All the normal stuff. Until my friend suggested we make a Ouija board. So on a sheet of paper we scribbled out yes, no, goodbye, a line of numbers and the alphabet. She told us all the rules and we nodded in agreement that we would follow. I remember being scared but wanting to fit in. I was also wondering whether this was a good idea. I remember when the first movement happened and I looked across to the girl opposite me and insisted she'd moved it. She said it wasn't her that moved the clear pebble we were all using as a planchette. We asked it dumb questions like who we each liked and if our crushes liked us. Typical middle school girl stuff. I don't remember much of these sessions other than the particular name Wanda, and that we had asked her if she was a demon, and she had told us she wasn't. After a while it wasn't so scary, and we began to enjoy it more and more. I remember feeling really excited, like I just wanted to keep playing, as if it were a video game. The next day I told my dad about it. My family was pretty open-minded about those things, so he wasn't mad or anything. He just wanted to make sure we were all doing it responsibly. Fast forward some time, and I was in my first year of college. I was over at a friend's place for her birthday, and she had talked about how she'd found this Ouija board, and we should try it out. I was a little hesitant, as now I realized the true implications of them. We eventually started setting boundaries, but I was still hesitant to believe that the planchette was moving on its own. My friend asked questions like, "When's my birthday?" and "What's my name?" I then shifted to questions away from myself, asking instead about the entity. My friend suddenly asked if the spirit knew my deceased grandfather's name, and it spelled out Louis. I was now in shock, because none of my friends had known that. I know that I hadn't directed the planchette to the letters, so I was surprised to see that it was correct. Later on, another friend of mine had said that she felt something grab her foot under the table. I was right next to her and I didn't feel anything, but at that point I'd advised that we say goodbye and call it a night. It was all just so weird. I've never had a truly bad experience, but it's still very creepy, to say the least. To those of you who deal with ghosts often, please advise. About a month or so ago, I, a 21-year-old male, was staying with my partner Crow at his family home. He's not long moved into his old and bigger room, and generally I get no bad vibes from it. For context, in case you need it, he has had a shadow spirit attached to him, and has done so for maybe 20 years. This shadow person always sends mixed messages on whether or not he's actually hurting him. He just gets vibes and can be possessive and protective around new people in Crow's life. One night, we happened to not get to sleep right away, which was uncommon for us, but not unsettling or weird. We just went to bed late. The room was pretty much completely dark, and we just lay in bed and both seemed to be staring at the ceiling. We didn't realize, though, that we were staring at the same thing. Crow turned to me and said, "Hey, do you see that?" "Yeah," I replied. We proceeded to watch this darker-than-a-usual shadow exist, almost completely still, in a normal-ish form, in the middle of the ceiling directly above Crow. After a few minutes, the shape started morphing and moving in the same spot, and changing size whilst doing so. Crow then said, "It kinda looks like it's moving." At this point, we both must have been thinking we were having some differing sleep-deprived hallucinations. And I said, "Yeah, it's moving a bit like an octopus. Does it have arms?" Crow was then a bit thrown, since he then confirmed that we were watching the same thing. The room was dark, but the shape was darker, pitch black, like staring into a living void on the ceiling above us. When we turned the light on to see if it was a shadow reflecting off something, it wasn't. It had nothing to reflect off. There was nothing moving in the room, and there was no light source to produce this shadow. We then sat up. It didn't move. It stayed there, moving violently on the spot and changing shape. I'm not even sure why we weren't even scared. We were just weirded out and curious. We were watching it for so long, I can't even remember. And I can't remember falling asleep. I was on a road trip with my mum recently, and we were on the topic of ghosts and shooting stories back and forth. One in particular I'd mentioned was one of my very first experiences as a young girl. This happened in the very first house my parents purchased in Washington when I was about 4 years old. It was a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom home, and my sister and I shared one of the rooms. I hadn't yet started school, and my younger brother was just an infant at that time, so it was often just my mum, brother and me at the house, while my dad was at work and my older sister was at school. It wasn't unusual for my mother to put me and my brother down for naps mid-afternoon daily, but I couldn't sleep because of the man in my closet. He wasn't real, I knew that for certain, at least not like me. He resembled a typical creepy old guy, middle-aged, balding head, moustache, and he would just sit in my closet, and that was it. All I really remember is feeling very uncomfortable and scared being alone in my room. Additionally, we shared a bunk bed, and I slept on the bottom bunk, and there was a sleeping woman laying above me. As a kid, I convinced myself that she was the Virgin Mary visiting me to keep me safe, as a way of comforting myself. But as I've grown older and remember the vibe that accompanied her, I don't feel that way now. It now seems much more sinister. What's even stranger, and this could just be coincidence or the result of an overactive imagination, but I recall just being terrified that a plane would crash into our house every single night. I remember pleading with God to keep our house safe because I didn't want a plane to crash into it, and it was something that truly terrified me. Again, not sure if it's related to the activity in the house, but I sometimes wonder if one of the two spirits was trying to tell me something. I feel I should preface this story with the statement that I am usually a skeptic when it comes to paranormal stories, albeit an open-minded one. I have never had an experience I would truly say was paranormal until this one. I have searched for hours on Google, attempting to find a similar story from someone else, but have had no luck. What really stands out for me is that there is an energy or feeling that accompanies the experience, and even remembering it still gives me this feeling and goosebumps. Now, this is not something I normally experience, and most people that know me would probably be surprised that I would be spooked by much of anything. And I have spent years since leaving the military working in emergency rooms, specialized security, and doing other high adrenaline jobs, and I am not prone to being creeped out. I am hoping to find someone else who may have had a similar experience, as I feel oddly compelled to relate to someone about this. With that being said, here goes. A couple of months ago, I was driving with my wife down a rural highway in Oregon, returning home from a road trip to Crater Lake. We live on the coast, and the highway we were taking to get back is very curvy as it winds through the Cascade mountain range. It was dark as ink and probably about 11 p.m, and we were driving along, and I was watching the road, going about 45 miles an hour. We rounded a bend which makes me slow down to about 45, and just as we get around it, my wife suddenly says, "Look out, there's a person there." It takes me a second for some reason as I let off the gas. Then I noticed her, him or it, crouched near the side of this 2-lane highway. On my left side is a person wearing what looks like grey baggy sweatpants or clothes and a reflective vest. Now this is an easy 20 miles either direction from civilization and is heavily wooded. Think Oregon coast forest. I begin braking and instantly the figure stands up, faces us, and begins jogging directly at the car. It felt like electricity in the air, as when she faced us, her head was flopped to the side, like her neck was totally limp, and her mouth was wide open. She appeared to have grey hair, and her arms or hands were held up to her chest, her wrists curled. Her legs didn't seem to be working right either, as she hobbled at us. Think like severe progressed MS. Then it hit. This primal-like feeling of dread, like my subconscious knew something wasn't right. I couldn't fully focus on her as the car was still moving and I had to steer, but my wife was looking right at her. My first thought normally would have been to hit the brakes and see what was going on, as once again this is literally miles and miles from town. But there was just this dread feeling in the air, and time almost seemed to slow down. At that moment I hear my wife say, "Don't stop, just go." Instinctively I accelerated. As we sped up, this lady was jogging right at us and must have come within a foot of running into the side of our car as we went past her. We rounded the next bend and I looked at my wife and just said, "What the hell was that? I should turn around. Who the hell jogs out here? What was wrong with her neck?" My wife just looked at me and said, "No, don't go back. I don't know what that was." I told her I couldn't look directly at her for long as I was focused in the road, but described what I saw and she confirmed she'd seen the same. She said when she came up to the side of the car, she was staring right at us, and my wife looked her in the eyes, but she didn't have any pupils, and her expression stayed just like frozen, with her mouth open. We scoured news stories, and I even contacted authorities, but they advised no one was reported missing or hurt out there. I still get this strange, intense, electrified feeling anytime I think about her, as does my wife. Anytime I talk about her, I am compelled to refer to the person as it. All I know is it wasn't right. We have now coined her the floppy-head jogger. Has anyone else experienced something like this? I have experienced paranormal occurrences throughout my life. The most recent experience I had with a spirit was last Thursday morning, 2 days ago. I sadly lost my mother to brain cancer back in April of this year, and it absolutely devastated me and my family. She was my best friend, and we often talked about magic, the paranormal and the supernatural. On said Thursday morning, I was awoken to the sound of loud knocking on my bedroom door. Now this would have been a normal occurrence if other members of my family had knocked on my door. But in addition to this, if there truly was someone knocking on my door, they would have said my name to get my attention, and everyone else in the house said they didn't knock. My mother, however, used to knock on my door before coming into my room often. As soon as I heard the knocking and became aware of what was going on, I half expected to see my mum open up the door and walk in. This experience gives me hope that I will be able to communicate with my mum in the future, regardless of where we are. I'm planning on cleansing my room and focusing my energy on spirit work to help build a stronger bridge of connection to the other side. After my mum's passing, I expected to see or hear signs of her presence immediately, but became disheartened when that was not the case. After months of hoping and wishing, I eventually had my first sure, clear sign from her. I was sitting on my bed, crying, having a really rough night because I missed her so much, and I said out loud, "Mummy, I wish you were here. I need you." About 2 seconds later I saw, directly in my physical eyesight, a white apparition gliding across my view. It didn't make me scared, but rather it made me feel calm and safe, as I knew immediately that it was my mother. Since the veil is thinning during this time of year, I'm hoping to have more and more encounters with spirits, especially my mum. I remember as an older teenager, I'd often spend my time at my grandparents' home, and after my grandpa passed away, my time there became more frequent. I protested mostly when I had to go, but I rarely had a choice since my parents didn't want my grandma to be lonely. Plus, I was the only grandchild at the time. I remember one evening when we were cleaning up and were in the dining room. The front door was visible from where we were, and my grandma had this shoe rack by the door. We were both facing it when suddenly the shoe rack flew against the front door. It was closed, and there was absolutely no one there that could have thrown it. Not anyone visible anyway. She tried to explain the event away, but I knew it didn't make sense. The next night I was in bed and could hear thudding on the floor of the basement below. I laid there wondering if my grandma had gone down there in the middle of the night, but she was in bed. I opened the door to the basement, and it was dark down there, so I didn't bother checking it out. I returned to my room, and the noise stopped. Not long after that, though, I could hear a scratching from the attic. I wrote it off as a wild animal maybe stuck up there, and I tried to get some sleep. A few weeks later, I was staying there again. This time it was after 3 a.m, and my grandma shook me awake. I asked her what was wrong, and she told me she'd seen someone by her bedroom door, headed toward the end of the hall where my bedroom was. She said she peeked around the corner and saw a figure in a dark cloak watching me through the crack in the open door. She said she sat on her bed and prayed, and after she was done, she looked again, and the figure was gone. Then she woke me up. I got chills when she told me all this. We stayed up until the sun came up, and during that time she told me what had been happening in the house, and to her. She said she was having the house blessed, and if it didn't stop, she would move. Eventually she did end up moving, and even to this day, I sometimes experience random things that don't make sense, though never as intense as what happened at my grandma's house. One of my fondest memories growing up was when my mother took me to Disney World and Epcot when I was 15 back in 1993. Unfortunately, my mother died in 2002 of breast cancer, and money was tight, so my husband decided to send my daughter and I back to Disney World, and he would stay home to save money. My daughter Grace is 5 years old, which many people say is the perfect age to go there. It was still as magical as ever, and hadn't changed that much since 1993. After getting out of the carousel of progress, something unexplainable happened. My mother was waiting for my daughter and I. To make it even odder, she addressed me like she'd never died, and like we'd just seen each other only yesterday. I was beyond speechless, but I had this warm glow all over my body, and I was just so overcome with elation. I said, "Mom, is that you?" My mother responded, "Well, who did you think it is? I was trying to make it here yesterday, but something came up." "Trying to make it from where?" I said. My mother responded with, "Oh, you know, silly." I thought to myself, no, I have no idea where she came from. Then my mother said, "Grace, my darling, are you having fun?" My daughter shook her head yes. Then my mother gave Grace a hug. And I said to Grace, "Say hi to your grandmother." I think my daughter was too young to comprehend anything that was going on. She was saying hi to her grandmother who died close to 20 years ago. I went to my mother's funeral. I saw her emaciated body from cancer in the open casket. But that didn't matter at this moment, because I had the one thing that I always dreamed for, and that was seeing my mother for one last time. I knew all the years of praying and going to church would pay off. My husband has never admitted it, but he is an atheist. He would sleep or play on his phone at church and showed no interest. At this moment, I'm on cloud 9. It was like I'd won the lottery. The three of us walked around the park with such glee. My mother looked around 20 years older from before the cancer ravaged her body. And she was bringing things up that happened before she died, and things that had happened after, like me getting married to my husband Jeff. The three of us waited in the long lines all day, which was great, because all we did was talk, and my mother interacted with my daughter the whole time. It was getting close to 9 p.m, and we watched the last parade of the day. I took my daughter to the bathroom, and when we came out, my mother was gone. We waited around for an hour until the park closed, and my mother never returned. I pleaded with security to track my mother on their video system, but the park was so busy that the security personnel couldn't tell where she went after she walked into the crowd that was walking towards the exit of the park. Security said either she put a disguise on or she'd just vanished. My daughter and I waited outside the park until midnight to see if my mother would return, and eventually security made us leave. I couldn't put in a missing persons report because she died in 2002. I cried the whole next day. I tried my best to pull myself together for my daughter's sake. And I called my husband about being with my mother the whole day, and he was in total disbelief. Neither of us could come up with an explanation. 6 months went by, and I was starting to get suspicious of my husband having an affair on me, so I looked through his work emails when he went to sleep. I found no evidence of an affair, but in his deleted email account there was a contract with a doppelganger for hire company where he paid $2,000 to have someone who looked like my mother meet us at Disney and spend the day with us. Apparently from doing online research, this company is primarily used to comfort people who have dementia that lost a loved one. I really didn't know what to think. Part of me felt betrayed, and another part of me thought it was sweet that my husband made that effort for me. I confronted him and he fessed up to it. I thought it made me feel really good for that day, so I couldn't fault him. He told me that he told the doppelganger for hire company things he knew about my childhood and when we got married. I forgave him and also thanked him for me and Grace having a really great day at Disney. Just when we thought it was over, something really strange happened. While I was in the park with the doppelganger, who was posing as my mother, she insisted on me taking no photos. I had joined a Facebook Disney group, and someone had posted pictures the same day we were there. The odd thing is that this person on Facebook was on the same boat we took to get to Tom Sawyer Island. The doppelganger, who was sitting right next to me, wasn't in any of the Facebook person's photos, and that was the only time I had went to Tom Sawyer's Island. My daughter was able to describe the woman who was with us that day, so I knew it wasn't all in my mind. Things got much weirder. My husband had actually received a refund because the assigned doppelganger had unknowingly, to my husband, backed out of going to Disney that day. I couldn't reach out to the company because it had gone out of business from multiple lawsuits, and we received the refund once the bankruptcy was settled in court. So now I'm left wondering, what on earth happened that day, and was it just all in my head? So a bit of background. I grew up in a very haunted house, occupied mostly by benevolent spirits, so contact with spirits isn't new for me. My faith has also led me to working lightly with spirits, so this experience wasn't startling or creepy. My wife and I recently took a weekend trip to Ashland, Oregon, to get away from the stress of life. We were staying in a recently renovated hotel in an area that has a history of paranormal activity, though none has been reported at this hotel. It's a chain, so that's expected. I awoke at approximately 3:30 a.m., feeling extremely warm, despite sleeping next to the AC, which was set to 62. I figured I was just dehydrated, as I've been having hydration issues lately, mostly due to stress from work. I rolled onto my back to grab my water cup when I felt cool hair in my face. I knew it wasn't my wife's hair, as her shampoo has a certain scent, and how she was laying wouldn't allow her face to cover mine. I drank my water and rolled back over to fall asleep. Next thing I knew, I could feel a weight behind me over the blanket and sheets. I felt a tingling sensation on my leg, which slowly moved up and down, which I figured to be my back issues acting up, and just shrugged it off. Shortly after, though, I felt the weight on the blanket press harder, and my back and stomach got cold, and I felt the hair on my back. Again, I was cuddling my wife, so her hair could not be on my back. After about an hour, the weight lifted from the bed, and my body temperature balanced out again. Typically, I'd assume I'd had an episode of sleep paralysis, but I was able to move, and I didn't suffer from any auditory or visual hallucinations. After the experience, and once I'd woken up, I felt a new light in myself, and my stress seemed to have melted away. It was the most pleasant paranormal experience I've ever had. But I was sure to instruct the spirit not to follow me. Just in case, I moved my security camera to point into my house rather than out. If the spirit didn't listen to my instructions to remain at the hotel, I'll be sure to post the videos. I've been living in Idaho for just over 4 years now, and I moved from the Dallas-Fort Worth area in 2015 with my parents. I'm 24 now, moved out of my parents' house and into my own apartment with my beautiful fiancé, and I couldn't be happier. Since I was already out of high school, and I keep to myself more than most, my group of friends is rather small. I'm fairly outgoing, and I've never had a lot of difficulty making friends. Still, the only place I ever really have a chance to talk to people is at work. I work as a correctional officer, a prison guard in simple terms. Being surrounded by inmates isn't exactly how I would prefer to spend my day, but it pays a good deal more than most other jobs at entry level. I've worked there for about 3 years now, and anybody that I could call my friend also works there. It's not the best setting to make new friends in, but it works. There are 3 people that I hang out with most of the time. Bowers, Reed, and Taylor are the people closest to me. Sure, I hang out with plenty of others that work there, but more in an everyone was coming so I came too kind of way. Bowers, Reed, and Taylor are their last names, and working where we do, that's how you know each other. I spend the most time with Taylor. He and I usually like to go ride our bikes around town and grab a bite to eat maybe, or just drive around and talk. Nothing too glamorous. I see Reed mostly at work, but he has quite a busy life, what with his wife and their new baby. His schedule is mostly dedicated to being a family man now, which is fair enough. I still see him whenever he has the opportunity, but Bowers, on the other hand, is who I have the most in common with. Now, I'm a big horror fan. I love scary movies, scary stories, scary places, and anything to chill your bones and make your skin crawl. Bowers is much the same. He's always talking about writing a screenplay for an amateur horror movie he wants to make. I also thought it was a good idea. So we'd sit at work and brainstorm together trying to come up with a story we deem scary and unique. It's not exactly easy in our primary setting. Prison is a scary place, but for a different reason. A lot of the time when we hang out with each other, we like to go adventuring to the more eerie places that Idaho has to offer. Given that there aren't too many places to go that will make the hair on your neck rise, we have to get a little creative. There are some mountain roads, a couple of abandoned properties, and just your run-of-the-mill haunted places. These places serve more of an inspirational purpose than anything. It gets us into the proper, on-edge mood to come up with the scary elements to a story. But when it comes to horror, Bowers also shares the majority of my views on what's really scary. We both agree that jump scares are, well, cheap. It doesn't take much to make somebody jump, and it generally doesn't matter what object, noise, or figures jump out. It will still make you jump. For me to fully enjoy a horror movie, I like the feeling of being creeped out. Instead of loud noises, I prefer more of a sense of, "Hey, did you guys hear that?" Instead of a scary face jumping from off-screen, I'd rather have something sitting off in the background, waiting for my view to fall upon it. And Bowers is exactly the same, so when it comes to individual preferences, they're almost identical. One day at work, Bowers came up to me and mentioned this place he'd seen a video on YouTube about. It was an abandoned factory, and I've got to admit, a factory sounded awesome. I had been to abandoned orphanages before, sure, but never a factory. So I asked him, "Just how abandoned is it?" He explained, "Well, from what I understand, it was abandoned sometime in the 1970s. It was a factory for making concrete, but when they built a new one, they just left the old one to rot." It sounded pretty promising. "Where is it?" I asked. "A city called Lime in Oregon," he said. I checked a map on my phone, and it showed that Lime was just across the border of Idaho and Oregon. Not a far drive at all, and the factory was just sitting off the side of the main freeway. The pictures I could find on Google just ensured that it would be a fantastic place to explore. My work week was coming to an end, so I texted Bowers, and we set up a time for us to both go. My Friday was actually his Thursday, so I figured the best time to go would be on my Saturday after he got off work. He worked until 10 p.m. that night, so we would have the perfect mindset when exploring this abandoned pile of concrete up in the high desert. I showed up to his apartment around 11:30 p.m., once he'd gotten home and changed clothes. He climbed into my Ford Ranger, and we headed off into the night, stopping only for some essential supplies, cigarettes and a couple of sodas. The drive was perfect. Traffic was almost non-existent going down the highway, and we had the proper soundtrack of some Pink Floyd to keep us company. I was following the GPS on my phone to the factory, even though we knew it was right off the side of the highway, but we presumed it would be too dark to spot. We hopped off the freeway and started down a partially lit road that then turned to dirt after driving down it for just a short while. Since we were in no hurry, I left my truck in second gear and we just coasted along this gravelly, pothole-riddled road, but eventually it led to concrete again. We had taken an exit that led to the town of Huntingdon, just to make the journey a bit longer, let it build up in our minds a little more. After another 15 minutes or so of driving, my headlights washed over the old concrete factory in Lime, Oregon. The main part of the factory was on the right-hand side of the road, and there were some old drummed silos on the left. We pulled off to the left and parked in the dirt. As soon as I turned my headlights off, we were bathed in darkness, with only the stale green glow from the time displayed on my truck's radio providing any source of illumination. I could instantly feel the sense of uneasiness fill me up. I wasn't exactly regretting the decision to come all the way out here, but it was the fact that we were all the way out here that made me nervous. I checked my phone and I had no reception. Bowers had no signal also. I had 2 small flashlights that we could carry and a full pack of cigarettes to calm my nerves. We also both were carrying our handguns, kind of a just-in-case measure. We got out of my truck and took a look around. As we stood there in the dirt, I looked up at the sky and noticed how brilliantly dark the surrounding area was. I could quite clearly see the Milky Way. Millions and millions of stars twinkled down at us, but instead of peace, I was feeling terror. Keep in mind, I did ask for this. This feeling that I'm experiencing is exactly why I love to be scared. My adrenaline was going a little haywire, so I lit a cigarette to relax myself a little. The dry, billowy smoke is just what I needed to calm down. Bowers followed suit and lit one for himself as well. The red glow from the cherry embers on the end of my Marlboro provided much more light than I had taken note of in the past, sending out a radiating red-orange light, almost to where is created a scarlet orb on the dirt around my shell toes. As we stood there in silence, we listened for sounds. There were no other cars around, except for the ones passing by on the highway every couple of minutes, but none parked near the factory. There was a slight breeze that wafted through the property, creating the illusion that something was moving objects around. There was a big hole in the ground, maybe 5 by 5 feet. When the breeze would hit it just right, would cause a whistle to emanate out into the warm, dry summer air. I walked over to the hole to look inside. I grabbed my flashlight and stood about a foot away from the edge. I clicked the power button and shined the light down inside. At the bottom, maybe 9 or 10 feet, lay piles of rubble, rock and wood. It was too far to jump down, so I aimed my focus elsewhere until such time that I could find another potential entrance. I looked back at Bowers, still standing in front of my truck, just staring off at the factory. I walked up to him and said, "Hey, this is pretty cool, man. Definitely a good choice." All he uttered was a simple, "Uh-huh." I suggested we go explore the rest of the factory, which he agreed. To get to the main collection of buildings, we had to walk up a slight hill. Once at the top, we both turned on our flashlights and aimed them around at whatever caught our focus. I was focusing more on the graffiti that was plastered all over the walls. Some of it was actually quite impressive. Not just the simple tags or names and dates, but actual murals. Some murals got so complex, they actually utilized an entire building. Mind you, some of the buildings are quite small, but they would base each one on what I think was supposed to be a Greek god. Each one had its own dedicated building as something of a tribute. I honestly couldn't tell you the significance, but it sure caught my eye. Bowers was focused elsewhere. His face didn't seem to show interest, but instead indifference. He would walk slowly from one window of a building to the next, turn to face it, shine his light in, and stare for a few seconds with a blank expression before moving on to the next one. It didn't quite make sense to me, as he usually loves this kind of stuff, but as of right now, he seems uninterested in anything. I walked over to join him at the 2 tallest smokestacks on the property. We poked our heads into some holes that looked like they were created after the place had been abandoned, and look up through the top of the stack. They looked even taller from the inside than they did from the outside. We explored pretty much every building that had an entry point that we could see. A lot of the roofs had collapsed, leaving some buildings inaccessible. Among more graffiti, the factory was now home to various wildlife from the area. Some bats and birds being the most mentionable. Other than that, the factory was pretty much dead. Other than a few noises that could be written off as animals or wind, maybe a couple of eye tricks. There wasn't much else. Still, enough to be frightening nonetheless. After exploring for about an hour, I'd gotten my fill of terror for the night. I had plenty of ideas for Bowers' screenplay, and still a sense of eeriness I was sure would last until morning. I looked at Bowers and said, "Well, I think I'm satisfied. Want to head back?" Still sticking with simple, inert answers, he replied, "Yeah." Now I've worked with Bowers for 2 years now, as he got hired after I did. After knowing him for that long, his responses were troubling. He usually had a lot more energy and enthusiasm than I did. I've never seen him like this. I didn't expect him to be terrified to the point of paralysis, but he'll normally speculate on some scary stuff that might be happening there with me. We could sit there and scare each other by humouring the other on a noise they thought they heard. But not tonight. If I'm being honest, Bowers was scaring me a lot more than the factory was. On the walk back to the truck, I decided to mention some ideas I'd had for his screenplay to see if I could drag him out of whatever funk he was in. Maybe you could write about this group of teenagers that find this old abandoned factory and they decide to go in and explore. Only while they're exploring, people keep disappearing from the group, I suggest. Yeah, that sounds cool, he replied. Okay then, more than one word, I'm getting somewhere. Or maybe instead of teenagers, you could have some kind of supernatural or poltergeist investigator, I said, who was going on this trip to this factory because the inhabitants of the town think the factory is haunted. Yeah, that may work. I kind of like the idea about the teenagers, because I think I'd be a lot more scared of someone in my group disappearing than a ghost, he explained. All right, this sounds more like him. Now I'm getting the old Bowers back. We made it down to my truck, still discussing other ideas about the screenplay. As we were getting into the truck, Bowers said, Hey, wait. Look, there's a tunnel over there that we didn't check out yet. I turned around, and under the line of silos there was a tunnel leading straight underneath them. Yeah, okay, I said. Let's go check 'em out. I closed my truck door and we made our way over to the silos. As we peered into the tunnel, it was pitch black. I could barely see moonlight on the other side. Still, I needed my flashlight to be able to navigate through it. The tunnel was probably around 7 feet tall. I could stand up straight in it, but because of some pipes that were occasionally protruding from the walls or ceiling, I'd have to duck every now and then. While we walked down the tunnel, the sounds of our shoes and breathing was amplified. It felt like I was walking through a horror movie. The sound was so enhanced it almost sounded fake, fabricated. Bowers was walking in front of me, so I was using my light to focus on the ground in front of us. His was aimed down at the end of the tunnel. I could see the end of it. It appeared to lead to a small concrete room with the ceiling partially collapsed. We were about 1/3 of the way through the tunnel, and still had maybe 150 feet to go. Out of nowhere, Bowers stops walking. I almost run into him because my view was focused on the ground. I asked him, "You good, man?" He replied, "I'm not sure." "Okay, what does that mean?" "I don't know," he whispered. "Dude, you're freaking me out. What's the matter with you?" He said nothing, just standing there in silence. I was getting worried, and if I'm honest, terribly paranoid. I started shining the flashlight back behind us, half expecting to see some creepy humanoid figure quickly crawling to catch up with us, but the tunnel was empty, with Bowers and I as its only inhabitants. Suddenly I hear a scratchy, rustling noise. I quickly turn around and see Bowers in a dead sprint, heading toward the end of the tunnel. I was confused, frightened and frozen. I watched as my friend ran toward the uncertain end of this dark, damp tunnel, with only his flashlight as a beacon, informing me of his distance. Part of me wanted to follow him, but I had no idea what to do at this point. In my head, I'm thinking, he's completely lost his mind, and I'm now stuck with him all alone in this tunnel. His light came to a halt in the little concrete room at the end of it. I could barely make out the outline of his body. He stood there with his flashlight pointing at the ground. I shined mine down the tunnel at him, and could see he was facing away from me, looking at the wall. I called out, "Bowers, what the hell are you—" Before I could finish, Bowers screamed as if he'd just met with his worst fear. I can't imagine what he'd seen, but it must have terrified him to his very core. He dropped his flashlight and started running back down the tunnel towards me. I put my hand on my pistol, ready to take aim at whatever comes behind him. As Bowers gets closer, I begin to see more of his face. He doesn't look terrified anymore, but happy, elated almost. I loosen my grip on my gun, thinking he was screwing with me. As he gets closer, his face goes from cheerful to angry. I could barely utter, "What's going on?" when Bowers runs past me and knocks me to the ground. I hadn't felt a hit like that since high school football. As soon as I got my bearings, I felt across the rocky ground for my flashlight. The moment I grabbed hold of it, I stood up and ran to follow Bowers back out of the beginning of the tunnel. I rushed out of the tunnel, back out into the open air. I pointed my flashlight and caught a glimpse of Bowers running up the hill back towards the main part of the factory. I stood in front of my truck, gazing up at this factory, just wondering what has possessed my friend to do this. My gut was screaming at me to get back in my truck, lock the doors and wait for Bowers to come back down the hill, laughing and telling me it was a joke, and that he just wanted to freak me out. Well, if that was the case, it was definitely working. I waited for a second to see if I could hear anything. His footsteps ceased, and the only sound that remained was the light breeze in the air. I stood waiting for what felt like an hour, and out of the darkness I hear Bowers call out, "Hey bro, come check this out." "No, I want to go home," I said back. I waited for a reply, but didn't get one. All I wanted was to be back in my truck, cruising down the highway, and headed back home. This was a little more of an adventure than I'd bargained for. "Bowers!" I shouted out. "Hey bro, come and check this out," was his reply. I have no idea what's going on, but I'm genuinely scared. I don't know what else to do except go find him. I pull my pistol out of its holster and hold it, if for nothing else than to make myself feel a little safer in this whole situation. I start to make my way up the hill and gaze again upon the factory. I shined my flashlight all around, searching for my friend. I called out his name again. "Bowers! Hey bro, come check this out." A feeling of dread began to pulse through me. "Well, you have to tell me where you are first," I said. Silence again. I couldn't accurately gauge where he was talking to me from, but he sounded far still. I continued walking toward the factory, going pretty much the same route that we had earlier. I was starting to panic. I didn't know where to look, what to listen for, or what to do. I walked past the giant smokestacks and toward the main grouping of buildings. I checked through every door I passed, looking for any sign of movement. I announced, "Listen, Bowers, I'm really freaked out right now, man. I have my gun cocked and ready, so if you're planning on jumping out to scare me, that wouldn't be a very good idea." No reply. "Bowers!" I yelled. From over to my left, I hear him. "Hey bro, check this out." I turned to face him. Bowers was standing through a doorway toward the back of one of the rooms. The look on his face will be forever burned into my brain. He didn't look scared, or happy, or angry anymore. He looked sad. Sad like he had just received the worst news in his life, then someone came and gave him even worse news. No tears or anything, just a frown with the most miserable eyes I've ever seen. I said, "What the hell happened to you back there, man?" He didn't move. His expression didn't change. He just stood there, frozen, almost catatonic. I took a step forward. "Look." I only got one syllable out before Bowers' face shifted from sadness to laughter. He was laughing in a very over-exaggerated manner, kind of a mocking laughter. The laugh wasn't the most disturbing element of this moment, though. It was how he had contorted his face into a horrific smile. I don't just mean a really big smile, but like an unnaturally wide grin, literally ear to ear. He began to lift his gun. "Bowers, no!" I screamed. He pointed his gun at me, and I took aim at him. He bent his arm and aimed at his head. "Hey bro, check this out!" And he pulled the trigger. The sound of the gun firing echoed off the walls of the factory and bounced off of the surrounding mountains, going back and forth like a metronome. Bowers' body stiffened, then collapsed onto the ground. Blood poured from his head, gushing out of his nose and mouth. There was so much blood I could hear the sound it made as it leaked out onto the concrete floor. I screamed. I screamed as loud as I could. I screamed for someone to come help. But then my screams turned to panicked cries, the kind of cries where you can't catch your breath. I've never had a panic attack, but that's the only way I can describe it. I turned and scrambled for my truck. I ran over the edge of the hill and jumped out into the road. Without stopping, I regained my balance and scurried across the street to my truck. I jumped in, started the engine, and got out of there as fast as I could. I sped down the highway, trying to get out of the mountains in range of the cell phone towers so I could call 911. I held my phone in my hand, waiting for even one bar of service to pop up. As soon as I see the first bar with the little 4G next to it, I opened the keypad and started to dial. I dialed 911 and pushed call. It rang only a couple of times, but then the call dropped. "God damn it, come on," I shouted to myself. Before I could dial again, my phone started to ring. It was my fiancé. I rejected the call so I could first call the police. I'll just call her back in a little while. I started to dial 911 again, but my phone started to ring again, and again. It's my fiancé. I answered the phone. "Hello?" "Hey babe, are you going to be home soon?" she asked. I replied, panicked. "You're not going to believe this. I don't know what to do. Bowers and I got to the factory, but he started to act weird. Then he killed himself. I'm so scared, I don't know what to do. I've got to call the police and get help." She said nothing. I assumed she was just as shocked as I was. "Babe, can you hear me? Did you hear what I said?" I asked. After several seconds of silence, I got a reply. Not in my fiancé's voice, but in a still very familiar voice. The voice said, "Hey bro, come and check this out." When I was about 10 years old, my neighbour died very suddenly. He wasn't old, maybe in his 40s, married, no kids, and to this date I don't quite know his cause of death. A routine operation gone wrong is what I was told as a kid. But anyway, I really liked this neighbour. He was nice to my siblings and me, and his wife baked cookies for us, and I only have fond memories of him as he was one of those adults who took children seriously. What happened? When my mum came back that evening from work, she told us about the neighbour and that he had died a few hours ago in the local hospital. Of course I was very upset, though I didn't cry. My sister and I shared a bedroom back then, so naturally we talked about our neighbour that night, how shocked we were, and how sorry we felt for his wife, who unfortunately turned into a very bitter and creepy woman after his death. After a while we said goodnight to each other and tried to go to sleep. I say tried because I couldn't sleep at all. I was still upset and also had a very strange feeling of being watched, and that feeling of something being in the room didn't go away. I didn't feel scared or anything, but it was odd, especially as I didn't believe in ghosts or anything paranormal as a child. Still, I tried my best to go to sleep and closed my eyes. When I did this, though, I was suddenly overwhelmed by this weird emotion. I don't really know how to describe it, other than that it made me feel very peaceful and lifted that sadness. It was then I felt compelled to say goodbye to my neighbour, saying his name out loud and not caring whether my sister could hear me or not. As I spoke his name, lying flat on my back on my bed, I then felt someone touch my forehead. I could distinctly feel a finger right between my eyebrows. My eyes were open and I saw nothing in the darkness, but I could feel this finger and the feeling it was an index finger. That sensation lasted for maybe a second or two, and I just knew it was my neighbor saying goodbye. I told my sister afterwards and she didn't believe me, of course, but I know what I felt. It wasn't just that touch, but also that feeling of peace. I'm sure it was our kind neighbor saying goodbye one last time.